Okay, so today we are going to talk about settings.xml first, and then we will integrate our Nexus repository which we have created in the last session with our Maven project. So the goal is to deploy the created jar file onto that central repository, that Nexus repository, right? That is our goal. But before we start, let's start the Nexus server which we have installed. So let me go to the directory where I have installed the Nexus server. Okay, let me just go to our project properties. Okay, this is the directory and this is our Nexus repository. So we need to be inside the bin. So let me start the command prompt. Let's change the drive to D, and we are now starting a Nexus server. So for that we have to change the directory to the bin folder where we have this Nexus application, and we will say Nexus/run. So it will start the server. Okay, now let the server start, and then we will by the time it gets started, let's start discussing about the settings.xml. Now basically Maven has few default settings, right? Like let's take an example, our local repository. So by default, local repository of the Maven gets created in our current user directory. So in my case, my current user is users pranod_id.m2, and this is my local repository. This is the default local repository. Now if you want to change the default settings, let's say if you want to change the location of the repository, okay, a local repository, then you can definitely change it. So for that you need to create one file called settings.xml. Now let's create a settings.xml. So it should start with the tag settings, close settings, and here you can specify the settings which you want to override. So you can definitely override the default settings of Maven. Okay, so here we will now change our local repository. So let's say I want my local repository to be on at some different place. So I'll say local repository. So please understand, this should be mentioned like this. The case should be this, right? A camel case. So local, this should start with a small l, and repository R, it should start with capital R. Local repository. Then let's local repository. Okay, and now let's say I want the local repository to be created at this location, say d:"my local repo. Okay, so I want this directory to be my local repository. So let's save this file. So this file should be saved with XML extension. So I have just changed my save as type to all files, otherwise it will get saved with txt extension, which we do not want. And the location of this file should be this m2 directory. So inside this m2 directory, but out of the repository directory. Okay, so the file should be present inside the m2 directory but outside of the repository directory. So I would say m2/ and name should be settings please understand, the name should be settings.xml. okay, now let me save. Now our local repository would be that location, the other location. Now let's see if we get that location, if we get that repository used or not. So what I'll do is I'll just right click on this project. I'll go to the Maven and I would say update project. So this will again build my project. Okay, I'll say force update and I'll say okay. Now let's go to the console and, or maybe let's see here itself. It will not show anything to us on the console, but let's see if the directory has been created or not. So I'll go to that location on my D colon. My local repository is my local repo. So I would just see if my local repo folder has been created, and inside this Maven has started downloading the plugins and dependencies for my project. So that's why we can see here. Now let's go to the project, and now if I just open this Maven dependencies, I can see these jar files are now connected from this my local repo location. You see here, previously there was this location, our default location, this C users .m2 repository. This was the location of the jar files, but now I have changed my local repo to some different location. Kindly understand this. So this is how you can override the default settings. Like local repository you can change. Many a times you will see that many a times you will see your machines are behind the proxy. The proxy is like, say this is my workstation or a machine. Now this Maven connects to the internet, that central repository maven.com, and from there it downloads the jars and plugins and different things. Now in many organizations, this internet connectivity always go through a proxy machine. So the proxy basically decides which traffic should go from our company network to outside, or which traffic should come from the outside network to inside the company's network, right? So that proxy basically controls the inbound and outbound traffic. So without proxy, you cannot, without going through basically a proxy, you cannot access the internet. Okay. Now if you have such proxy defined in your network by your network team, then that proxy details also you need to mention in this settings.xml. Okay, remember, otherwise Maven will not be able to download the dependencies, the plugins from central repository. So it should be, if the traffic is allowed only through the proxy server, then that proxy details need to be mentioned in this settings XML. Okay, so that is what the settings XML is. Now next point where we are going to use this settings XML is, we are going to basically change the remote repository, right? Our current remote repository in the sense from where our these dependencies and all gets downloaded, right? Now we want basically when we deploy, still the downloading of the dependencies and downloading of the plugins would be happening from Maven central repository. So we don't want to change where we download from, but what we want to change is, if I deploy, if I execute a goal called deploy, so the jar file which gets created for our project, we want to deploy that jar file to our Nexus repository. So kindly understand, there are two things here. The repository where we download it from is different, and the repository where we want to deploy it to is different. Okay, so we want to change the repository where we deploy our artifact. Deploy our artifact to Nexus. This is what we want to do. We want to downloading say dependencies and plugins will continue to happen from Maven central repo. So there is no change there. From where we are downloading is not something we want to change, but we want to change where we want to deploy. Where we want to download it from, we want to change this also, but we would be doing it in our next session when we would be using our consumer project. So we are going to create one more project which will consume our library, and then that project will download the library from our Nexus repository. Okay, so there are two things here. One, configuring the repository to deploy our project to, and configuring the repository where you will download your dependencies from. So these are two different settings to different concepts. We are currently talking about setting up a Nexus to deploy our artifacts to, our jar file to. So for that, we need to, first of all, I have already taken out those settings here. So we need to add this setting in our settings.xml. So I'll just go to my settings.xml. Inside the settings tag, I'll just mention this tag. I'll explain this, what it is. So password and server. Okay, now let's understand this. So basically we are defining one server setting. Okay, this is that server setting. In this ID you can refer to your server with any ID. So I would say Nexus release, because this is the repository where we are going to release our jar files to. So release username and password. Now this is very important. So which username and password we should mention? So the user who has got the rights, like if you guys remember in the last session we had created one user, right? We had created, and we also had discussed about different roles there. So we had created one role, senior developer, junior developer. Then that senior developer role basically has got the permissions to download the artifacts from the repository, push the artifacts to the repository, even browsing is also allowed there. So we created two different roles there, and then we basically assigned those roles to different users created, right? So you should be mentioning the username and password of that user who has got the permissions to deploy or upload the artifacts to the given repository. So kindly understand, if you mention a name of the user or the credentials of the user who doesn't have the rights to upload the artifacts, your deploy goal will not be able to deploy or upload the artifact there. You will get unauthorized access error there, right? So for now I will mention the admin user credentials, then we will mention the credential of the other user which we had created. But for now let's keep the thing simple. I'll say admin and admin 123. Okay, this is our username and password. This is one change which we have to do. Another change will go in our pom.xml. Here we have to do another change. Now what that change is, I'll tell you. Just a second. Okay, now another change which we have to do that change in our pom.xml. So for that we have to create one tag called distribution management. Okay, so which we will be creating now in this. So let's create that. So inside this build tag we will, just a second, distribution management, I think it is, just a second, it is to be created outside of the build. Distribution management, yes. So inside this distribution management we will create, or rather we will define our repository. So this distribution management is when you will create your artifact and now you want to deploy it, so where that artifact should be deployed to, that is distribution management. Now inside this you will create repository. So which repository you want to deploy your artifact to, right? And here we have to define different settings of our repository. Now what do I mean by different settings? Now let's see. First we have to define an ID. Now what do I mean by ID here? So ID which I defined here, do you see this in this server tag inside my settings.xml? Inside my settings.xml we have just configured one server. So this server has got three settings. One is ID, any string you can define as an ID here, and the username and password, right? So ID which you have defined for that server, this one should go to, this value should go as is here for the ID of your repository. Okay, this is one setting. Another, name. So you can provide any name to your repository. So I would say Java library, Java lib repository. So this repository is for our to deploy our Java libraries. So some name, and here we are going to provide the URL of our repository. I'll show you how to get that URL, and that's it. I mean, these three settings we need. Now what will happen is, when we will deploy, when we will run our deploy goal, okay, so what will happen is Maven will read the section, distribution management section. It will read the ID which is configured here for a repository, distribution repository. It will read the ID. It will go to the settings.xml. It will check where that ID is defined, okay, which server is configured with that ID. So this is the server which is configured with that ID, right? So it will get this server. It will basically match that ID which is defined here with the ID defined for our server tag inside settings.xml. Then it will read the username and password, and then with the help of this username and password, Maven will be authenticated with our Nexus server there, and then by that it will get that access to the server, and then here we will mention the URL of our repository. Okay, so to this repository, then Maven will deploy that artifact, provided the username and password which you have mentioned here, that user should have the required rights to the repository. If it doesn't have the rights, then Maven will not be able to deploy the artifact. Okay, that is the point. Now let's understand how to get the URL. Now let me see first what has happened here. I have started the Nexus basically, so it looks like there is an issue here. Let me see what is the problem in getting our Nexus started. Let me go up. Just a minute. I think my disk has been is full. It looks like. That's why I'm getting this error. Not an issue. Let me just terminate this, and let me just clear out few files from my D colon, because D colon is where I have my repository configured. So I'll just delete few things from here. Just a second. So I'll just delete this, and let me start the server again. Let server start, and then we will log in inside that server from our browser. We will get the URL of our repository, and we will mention that in our settings XML, not settings XML, in our form XML over here. Over here we have to provide the URL of our repository we have created. Right, so let me open a browser. Let me go to the incognito window and let me say localhost :8081. If you guys remember, this is where our server is running. Now, where we have configured this, I'll show you again. See, in this Nexus, in the etc, in Nexus default properties, this is the port and this is the application host. Okay, so 8081. So let the server start. It will take few more minutes, and then it will start, and then we will log in. See, let's wait, because the server is not yet started. Let it start. Yeah, again I am having few issues. Let me see. No, it is started. Okay. Correct. So our Sonatype Nexus repository. So let's sign in with admin user, admin 23. Now let's get the URL of our repository. Okay, So let's go to the repositories, and our repository which we have created is this DevOps batch 1, and this is the URL. So we have to specify this URL here. That's it. Okay, so now we are all set to deploy our artifact to this repository. Now let's run the deploy goal. Let's run it from the we can run it from the command prompt also, but we can run it from the Eclipse as well. So yeah, yes, someone has raised the hand. Username is misspelled. Let me see the username. Yes, admin, it should be. Okay, so I have corrected the spelling, and now let's go to the POM XML. So let's right click on the POM, run as. Let's run this Maven build, and here we have to specify the goal as deploy. Okay, let's deploy. So it will download the plugins which it needs. Now currently it is downloading all of these plugins because we have changed the local repository, right guys? Now our C users M2 repository is no more our local repository. Our local repository is changed now. So that's why it is downloading all the things again. Okay, so let me see what we have got here. Correct. Now Maven deploy uploading. So let's see if the artifact is uploaded or not. Let's go to the browse. Okay, we do not have that uploaded yet. Let's see what is the problem. Failed to execute goal, it is what it says. Could not transfer artifact. $500 server error. Okay, let's see. Let me see now. What's the problem? I understood. So actually I need 4 GB of space, and my D colon is not having that, that space. So that's why I'm running out of a disk space there. So that is the problem. So okay, now what I would do is, actually if you see now guys, on my D colon I do not have the space there. Here I have only 2.5 GB of space on this, and the default, the thing is, like on my D colon we have set up the Nexus repository, right? Now let me go to that. I'll show you the setting also. See here. Yeah, here I have got. Now let me delete these videos as well, because these have already been uploaded. So let me delete these so that I can free up some space, right? Now let me just do Control C and let me start the server again. We can change that that setting also, but let me free up the space by deleting the unnecessary files from there. But that is why my server is giving me the issue, nothing else. That's what your Nexus might get out of space, like if you go on creating more and more artifacts, so certain point of time it will start giving you issues. That's why that cleanup policy is very important. And here, do you see this Sonatype dash work? So this is where your artifacts are stored actually. So whatever you will deploy, So the entire database of our Nexus repository is configured here, right? So this is where your artifacts gets stored on a server. So if if whatever the artifacts you will deploy, they would be ultimately get stored here, and then if if you don't clean up those artifacts regularly, then definitely your Nexus server will go out of memory sooner or later. Okay, so let's wait. Let me see the space. Now I have got the enough space. Do you see 5.43 GB, and it needs 4.096. That is 4 GB at least it needs. So I'm good with the space now. Yeah, let's wait. Now we will not see any exception here. Previously we had got the exception here. Now there is no exception and our server started fine. Now let's log in inside the server. Correct. So see here, this is where our jar file is. It's uploaded now, right? So let me show you one more time. Let's change the version of our artifact. So let me go up to the POM XML and let me change the version as say 2.1 for example. Okay, and now let's go to the POM, right click, run as, and let's say Maven build, and I would say deploy. So as soon as I would say deploy, it will perform all the phases, like it will compile. We'll see. I will go through the logs and we'll see the yeah 2.1. So we have got the 2.1 also deployed. Right, now let's check the execution. So you can see here, so it will first download all the resources, right? Then it will compile our source code, and then it will compile our test case code. So this is the goal for it, test compile. So it will compile our unit test code, then it will trigger the Surefire plugin. Surefire plugin will trigger our testng. Testng will execute the tests we have configured in our testng XML, and all the tests would be executed. Once the tests are executed, it will go to the next phase, that is building a jar file. It will package all the classes right inside a jar. Then that jar file would be installed first into the local repository. Now let's go and check the local repo. So I would go to d:, and what was the name of our repository? Local repository, my local repo, right? So my local repo. Let's go here. You see there is a folder called DevOps Patch 1, which is the group ID for our project. So this is the group ID of our project. So inside the group ID folder, there would be a folder with artifact ID, calculator API. Inside the calculator API, there would be a folder called, for a version actually 2.1. Inside this, you will see the library installed, and then it will be deployed finally. Okay, now let's go and here it will deploy. So it is saying uploading to, so this is the URL which we have mentioned. So this is the URL which we have configured here, this URL. Okay, so the URL it has mentioned there, and now it is deploying that, uploading that artifact to our repository, and that is what you see here, right? So this is how you can deploy your artifact to a Nexus repository, which is your own repository, a Maven repository which you have created inside your network. Okay, so instead of using Maven Central, that is a public repository. If you deploy your artifact there, anyone would be able to download it. But if you want to create your own private infrastructure, you can create private repository also there, but that is chargeable. Even npm a private repository is chargeable. Even Docker repository, private repository is also chargeable. Maven repository, if you want to create a private one, that is also chargeable, right? So you can configure your Nexus server. Inside the Nexus server, you can create multiple repositories of multiple types. So you can create Maven repository, you can create npm.js even repository, you can create Docker repository, you can create Helm repository. So whatever the artifacts you would like to deploy, for that you can create different repositories and you can deploy your artifacts there. But the thing is, maintaining the server, cleaning it up, if it goes down or something, then getting that up again, so that would be your responsibility. That is the main challenge here. Like, this Nexus, if it goes down, say for example, for some reason, then you have to dig it out and then you have to correct that. Otherwise your developers will not be able to use it unless the Nexus repository is up again. So this is one of the disadvantage, you can say, over using the repositories on the web. But still, very many organizations, they prefer to use their own self-hosted repositories over the central repository.